Hi, everyone. I hope you're doing well. I wanted to show some enhancements to Illuminated Cloud to help you take ownership of the way API versions manifest in your Salesforce metadata and projects. I've been speaking with some users about this recently, and it manifests in a lot of different ways and can create a lot of different problems. If you're not familiar with it, the API version is the way that Salesforce allows its platform to evolve over time while maintaining backward compatibility. So every time that they release a new version of the platform, think summer 23, winter 24, they bump the API version, and that can introduce new features, but they also maintain backward compatibility with previous API versions, and that can be as coarse-grained as just the way that you communicate with their SOAP and REST APIs, and as fine-grained as the way that an individual Apex class or Lightning Web Component or something like that executes. It may execute against a very specific API version based upon the API version declared in its companion meta XML file. And the fact is that it may not be obvious exactly what API version is being used when certain operations occur. So you may try to deploy a piece of metadata to the server using Illuminated Cloud or using the CLI, and it may fail, and you may not understand why it fails because you don't know which API version was being used. You may try to retrieve metadata, and it may be missing certain expected new elements because it is being retrieved through an older API version. So hopefully this tool will help to gain insight into how API versions exist in your Salesforce metadata and gain ownership of that, and to align on a consistent API version allowing for exceptions as necessary. So let's take a look. This new tool manifests as a new code inspection. Under the Salesforce group, the inconsistent API version code inspection. It is enabled by default in the bundled inspection profile. So you can see down here the inconsistent API version is enabled. But if you have, as would be consistent with best practices, cloned that code inspection profile into your local project and customized it, maybe you've set the PMD rule set, things like that, you've turned off or configured certain code inspections, you will need to go into your custom code inspection profile, and you'll need to enable this because it won't be enabled by default in your code inspection profile unless unless this is unchecked, disable new inspections by default. Now let's take a look at how you configure this. So the first thing you need to do is you need to select an authoritative or reference API version against which everything else is going to be verified. And that can be one of 4 different values. So it can be the latest supported API version. Again, every time Salesforce updates their platform, once that's deployed into all organizations and all instances, Illuminated Cloud gets updated generally within a day, like the Monday after. And it not only adds support for all the new features, but it also begins to communicate with Salesforce against the latest API version. And if you wanted to always stay on the latest and greatest, you could just choose this first option. The default is the next option, which is to use the configured Illuminated Cloud 2 connection API version. And if it's a scratch org, that's actually going to be indirectly picked up from the scratch org project's SFDX project.json. But if it's not against a scratch org, it's going to be explicitly configured for that connection. And I'll show that in just a moment. You can choose to use the SFDX project.json API source API version. You can kind of see it in the background here. Or you can choose to use the package XML API version. Now, the reality is, while this is the default because it works with all different types of project types, metadata projects, metadata format projects, source format projects, scratch org projects, non-scratch org projects, whatever, you're almost certainly going to want to choose one of the following 2 options depending upon maybe the way that you use CI/CD tools outside of your IDE. So if you are using the API version from your SFDX project.json, you don't use a package XML based metadata subscription and deploy and retrieve against that, then you want to use an SFDX project.json. If you do use a package XML based metadata subscription, and you deploy and retrieve through that, not just in Illuminated Cloud, but perhaps using other CI/CD tools, then you want to use a package XML-based subscription and align against that. In this example, let's go ahead and choose the SFDX project.json API version and use that as our reference API version. You can see that the options change based upon the selected option because it doesn't make sense to verify the version in SFDX project.json when that is our reference API version. So you can verify these other qualities of your Illuminated Cloud projects: the configure connections API version, the source API version in your SFDX project.json if it's a source format project, the package XML if it's a package XML based subscription, and all your various metadata XML files that have their own API versions. And if there are some of those that need to be locked in against a previous API version or a different API version for backward compatibility, you can add them as exceptions here to make sure you dial in the signal to noise ratio for this code inspection. Now you could enter them explicitly here, but I'm going to show you how you would actually do that in practice as we go to the next phase of this demo. So why don't we go ahead and hit OK. And so let's see what we see in these files. And you see it updated because I changed the reference point from configure connection to SFDX project.json. So no longer does it show a warning here, but it does say that our connection uses API version 57.0 and the SFDX project.json, which is our reference point now, uses 56.0. So it gives us a couple of options for fixing that. So why don't we go ahead and fix the connection so that it uses 56.0. And so I'm going to do that, and we can even verify that. We can go look at the connection here, edit connection. We can see it now uses 56.0 instead of 57.0. Okay, so let's go to our package XML, and we can see that it is now setting up a warning saying that it uses 54.0 and our SFDX project.json uses 56.0. We have a meta XML file here that's on a very old version, and so obviously do we want to fix that? And we have options for fixing that, including changing this file, changing SFDX project.json. That you would rarely want to change your reference point, or to add this to our ignore list. And we'll do that in just a moment. And because very often you don't see your meta XML files because they're hidden automatically in the tree in Illuminated Cloud, and unless you go to this tab, you don't necessarily see it. That same warning is surfaced on the corresponding metadata file, source file, so that this problem is not necessarily buried in your meta XML files. So why don't we go ahead and change this so that we get rid of this warning. So in this case, let's just imagine for a moment that this class is using something that if we were to update, it would break when we deploy. It needs to be locked in on this older API version. So we want to add this as an exception. So we'll go ahead and do that. Now the reason that we don't do this as a and we can see, by the way, that it's also that warning's gone away in the meta XML file. The reason this is not done as a comment-based suppression like you would have with other code inspections is because that comment would be lost in round trip. So if we deployed this metadata file to Salesforce and then retrieved, it doesn't retain that comment, and you would have to constantly reconcile that. So instead, this is maintained externally. Now we can see that that exception was added here. So we can see the path here has been added to our ignored files. And you may look at this and go, well, I want to check this in and share this with my team. And not everyone is on Windows using Windows-based paths. And of course, not everyone's path includes a username Scott, because not everyone's named Scott. So I'm not sure that's going to work. Well, let me show you how this manifests in the actual file. So this is the file. It's been modified in a couple of different ways. We can see that versus what's checked in, we can see that the API version source has been changed from the default. So it's been added. The default is against the configured connection. It's been changed to align against reference point of the SFDX project.json API version. And we have added an ignored file path, and you can see that that is not an absolute path. It's a project relative path. And that can be shared across projects. And you can see that it uses OS independent path separators. So you can check this in and share it with your team. All right, so what we'll do, instead of fixing this here, we could fix this here. I'm going to go ahead and undo that. Let's look at how you would actually do this in practice. Instead of doing it onesie-twosie, why don't we go ahead and look at what it means for us to do this across the entire project. So we're going to go to Code and go to Analyze Code, and we're going to run inspection by name. And the inspection we want to run is, of course, the inconsistent API version inspection. And we're going to run across the whole project, include test sources, and it's picked up our configuration. So we're just going to go ahead now and say OK and let it run. And we're going to see it's found a whole host of issues, over 300 issues here. And if we expand this, we can see that we've got all these different inconsistent API versions. And this is very possibly what you're going to find in your own project. And we really want to align those against our reference API version sourced from sfdxproject.json. And let's go ahead and click at the top, and we can do this in mass. I'm going to say change file API versions, and it is going to update all of these files. And so when it gets done, we can go and take a look at what has happened. Let's go to version control. And we can see that we now have 329 changed files. So the first one is, of course, the one we just looked at, that we're going to check in the inspection profile. And it changed our package XML to match. And it changed all of these individual API versions on these meta XML files. And again, if you had like a .flow file and a metadata format project, things like that. But everything is now aligned. And so let's run that code inspection again. And we should not get any errors because we fixed the things that could be changed. We've changed things that could be changed, and we've ignored the things that could not be changed. So if we run it, we can see that it ran across the entire code base with nothing to report. Now the next step is to make sure that everything's good. So what I'm going to do is deploy these changes to the server. So I'm just going to go to the top of my change list. I don't know if everybody knows this, but you can use the contextual actions. So deploy on save, force save, things like that, against really any place where there is a scope, and it'll pick up that contextual scope. So I'm just going to use Control S if you're on a Mac, Command S, and you'll see down here it's going to deploy all the modified files from my change list. And so as soon as this actually deploys, we should see that it deploys successfully. We could check this in, and that becomes our new baseline in terms of API versions. And at that point, you're really just managing one-offs. You can see the problems as they occur. If I were to go and change the connection API version, if it were to get out of sync, that would show up as a banner on top as it did with all files before. So if we go in and actually do that, I'll show you that we could see immediately changes that would cause issues. So let's do this. And I see a banner across all these files. And so I can go ahead and fix that and change it back. If you bring down new metadata and it has inconsistent API versions, you would see that. You could go and just run this code inspection again across your entire code base, and whatever problems you have would come up, and then you would go and address those. So this is a way that you can create a new baseline and then very easily have a good signal noise ratio as you maintain this over time. So that's really it. That's the demo. I hope this is something people find useful. I know, again, this is an issue with Salesforce development, and hopefully this helps to gain insight into it, to create a new baseline, and then to really manage it over time. If you start using this and you find issues, false positives and false negatives from the code inspection, you use the quick fixes and they don't do exactly what you'd expect. You add ignored files, and they're either not ignored or the files aren't picked up. If you find that there are API versions in places other than those listed here, let me know about them. If you find that there is another place that you would want to set as your reference API version, let me know about that. And if it's something that is not a total one-off, something that other people would want as well, I'll add it to the list. I want to make sure that this is something that could be used by anybody and is going to be easy to use and have high quality and a good signal noise ratio, so that this becomes a useful tool and not something that you kind of ignore what it says or turn it off. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time, and just send me any feedback that you have. Take care.